In the candlelit ballrooms of Wiltshire, Charlotte Hartley had learned to disappear in plain sight. A duchess in name only, married not for love, but to settle her father's ruinous debts, while her husband's silence built walls colder than the deepest winter frost. But behind the swirl of silk and the polite laughter, a quieter danger was already moving through the crowd. A rival who had once expected to wear the duchess's jewels herself, a forged letter waiting in a gloved hand, a trap built to destroy the one thing Charlotte had left, her name. And when a stranger dared to ask her to dance not once, but 3 times, that trap finally sprang. What was Sebastian Hartley truly hiding behind his icy composure, and why had he let the whole county believe he did not love his own wife? Stay with us to the very end to find out exactly how far one silence can go, and what it takes to finally break it. Sit back, get comfortable, and let us tell you the story of Charlotte Hartley, the Duchess so thoroughly ignored at her own husband's balls that it took another man asking her to dance 3 times in a single evening just to make the Duke finally look up. If you've ever tried a little harmless jealousy to get someone to notice you again, let us know in the comments below how that went for you. Charlotte Hartley set down her husband's untouched cup of chocolate, straightened her spine, and left the breakfast room at Amberley Hall without a single word, because after 11 months of saying good morning to a man who never lifted his eyes from his correspondence, she had simply run out of things to say to the back of a newspaper. If you have ever loved someone who looked straight through you, this story is for you. Stay until the very end, and tell me in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight. She had been invisible for exactly 11 months and 6 days. She knew the number, the way a woman knows, the number of steps between her bedchamber and the room she is no longer welcome to sit in without an invitation, not because she counted with any great drama, but because a woman who has nothing else of her own soon learns to keep very careful accounts. Charlotte Hartley, Duchess of Wiltshire, had not always counted days. She had once, a lifetime ago it seemed, counted only the ordinary things. A girl of good family counts the number of gowns she owned, the number of dances promised at an assembly, the number of days until harvest. That girl had been Charlotte Fairfax, daughter of Sir Henry Fairfax of Fairley, a baronet whose estate in Hampshire had once been modest but respectable, and whose gambling debts, by the winter of 1814, had become neither. She had been 20 years old when her father came to her sitting room with a face the color of tallow and told her, in a voice that shook only slightly, that the Duke of Wiltshire had offered to settle every debt owed against Fairley, every note, every mortgage, every shilling her father had lost to cards, and worse in exchange for her hand. She had not asked why. A woman in her position did not ask why. She had simply understood, the way one understands weather, that a proposal from a duke was not truly a proposal at all, when it arrived wrapped around the ruin of one's family. She had said yes, because there had been nothing else honest to say, and 3 weeks later she had stood in the small stone church at Fairley in a gown hastily let out at the seams, and become the Duchess of Wiltshire before she had ever once been properly introduced to her husband. His Grace Sebastian Hartley, Duke of Wiltshire, was 28 that winter, tall enough that he seemed to require rooms built to a different scale than other men, with hair so dark it swallowed candlelight, and eyes the gray of a sky before storm, a color that gave away nothing and forgave nothing either. He was a man whose silence commanded more obedience in a room than most men's shouting, and Charlotte had learned within a fortnight of her marriage that his silence was not reserved for strangers. He kept it for her most faithfully of all. She remembered, with the peculiar clarity of a moment one returns to too often, the first time she had seen him properly on her wedding morning, standing at the front of a small stone church with his hands clasped behind his back and his face arranged into an expression of perfect courteous neutrality, as though he were waiting not for a bride, but for a delayed coach. He had said his vows in a voice that did not waver, had placed the ring on her finger with hands that were, she noticed, even then, unexpectedly careful, and had kissed her cheek, not her mouth. Her cheek, the barest formal brush of it, with a restraint so complete that the vicar himself had looked faintly startled. She had told herself, riding away from Fairley in a carriage bearing arms she did not yet recognize as her own, that restraint was not the same as indifference, that a man might simply require time, that she had married into a family colder by breeding than her own, and must not mistake their particular climate for winter everlasting. She had believed this for perhaps a month. Amberley Hall itself had not helped her disbelieve it a vast grey house of 100 rooms, most of them shuttered and cold, its portraits watching her progress down every corridor with the same flat, assessing stare she would come to recognize before long as the family's inheritance. The housekeeper, a kind, harried woman named Mrs. Prescott, had shown her to the Duchess's apartments with an apology already half formed in her mouth. "It has not been properly aired in some years, Your Grace," the last Duchess having passed when his Grace was but a boy, and Charlotte had stood in the center of a room built for a woman of twice her consequence and understood, with the particular loneliness of a bride 4 days married, that she had exchanged one kind of scarcity for another. He was not cruel. She wished sometimes, in the dark honesty of 2 in the morning, that he were cruel, because cruelty at least would have meant he had noticed her enough to wound her on purpose. What he offered instead was a courtesy so complete and so absent of feeling that it functioned, in every practical sense, as a wall. He rose before she woke. He dined with her when society required it, and in silence when it did not. He inquired after her health with the same even tone he used to inquire after the state of the West Fields, and he had never once, in 11 months, asked her what she thought about anything at all. The Dowager Duchess of Wiltshire, Sebastian's mother, was a woman named Margaret Hartley, 61 years old, straight-backed as a bell tower, with a talent for saying devastating things in the mildest possible voice. She had not wanted Charlotte for her son. She had wanted, quite specifically, and for the better part of a decade, Lady Cecilia Pemberton, 26, exquisitely bred, the daughter of an earl, and possessed of the particular cool beauty that made older women sigh with satisfaction and younger women go quiet with envy. Cecilia would have known how to hold a household, the Dowager remarked one afternoon in October, apropos of nothing, while Charlotte sat mending a torn hem because she had sent the seamstress home early rather than ask for help she did not think would come. She was raised to it. One cannot teach breeding, my dear, however hard one tries. Charlotte had learned not to answer these remarks. She had learned that the household staff watched to see whether she would cry, and she had learned, with her own mother's steadiness running quiet and stubborn beneath her ribs, that she would not give them the satisfaction. Her mother dead these 6 years, but present still in every straight line of Charlotte's spine, had told her once that a woman who wept at every insult would spend her whole life with red eyes and nothing to show for it. Charlotte had taken it as scripture. What she did instead of weeping was become useful, ferociously, thoroughly useful, in the particular way of a woman with nothing else to hold on to. She learned the household accounts until Mr. Prescott, the steward, stopped bothering to check her figures. She learned the names of every tenant family on the Wiltshire lands, learned which children had been ill through the winter, which fields wanted draining, which cottages needed new thatch before the rains. She kept a small book with a brass clasp in which she recorded it all, in a hand grown neat and quick from long practice. And she told no one what it cost her to be so competent and so thoroughly unseen. She had a lady's maid, a girl of 22 named Susan, sharp-eyed and quick-fingered, whom Charlotte had trusted foolishly. She would later understand with the small confidences a woman shares with the person who dresses her hair each morning. It would be some months yet before Charlotte learned that Susan carried those confidences, folded neatly as letters, directly to Lady Cecilia Pemberton, who paid handsomely for the privilege of knowing exactly how unhappy the new Duchess of Wiltshire truly was. There was, in those early grey weeks, one small corner of Wiltshire life in which Charlotte did not feel invisible at all, and that was the lane of tenant cottages beyond the home farm, where an old widow named Mrs. Bellows kept 3 goats, a temper, and no patience whatsoever for duchesses who stood on ceremony. Charlotte had gone there first on an errand of Mr. Prescott's, to ask after a leaking roof, and had found Mrs. Bellows on her knees in the yard attempting, with limited success, to extract a stubborn nanny goat's head from between 2 fence rails, the animal bleating with operatic outrage the entire while. Charlotte had set down her basket without a word, hitched up her skirts in a manner the dowager would have found deeply improper, and taken hold of the goat's hind quarters while Mrs. Bellows worked the horns free, and the 2 of them had gone over backward into the mud. Together the instant the animal came loose, both laughing too hard to rise for a full minute afterward. "Well," Mrs. Bellows said, wiping her eyes and surveying the ruin of Charlotte's second-best pelisse, "I did think dukes' wives were made of finer stuff, Your Grace, but I'm glad to be wrong about it." "Please," Charlotte said, still catching her breath, "call me Charlotte, at least until this pelisse forgives me." It became, without either of them quite planning it, a habit, a standing Tuesday visit that Charlotte guarded as fiercely as any appointment in the county. An hour spent drinking bitter tea from a chipped cup and listening to Mrs. Bellows's opinions on everything from the vicar's sermons to the folly of young men who went for soldiers. An hour in which nobody weighed her against a woman she had never met, and nobody required her to be anything other than a girl who was rather good. It turned out with a stubborn goat. She told no one at the great house where she went on Tuesday afternoons. It was, she thought, the one entirely selfish thing she permitted herself, and she did not intend to give it up for anyone's approval. The autumn assembly at Amberley Village Hall was not the grandest event of the Wiltshire season. That honor belonged to the Duke's own winter ball. Still 2 months distant, but it was the first true gathering since Charlotte's marriage, and half the county had turned out to look at her. She wore ivory silk with a sash the color of a November sky, chosen entirely by herself, which remained, she reflected wryly, the only corner of her life in which her husband's opinion was neither offered nor required. The carriage ride had been 20 minutes of a silence that was not comfortable, merely quiet. Sebastian looking out one window and Charlotte the other, until he said, without turning, "Lord Rutherford will be present tonight. I mean to speak with him about the enclosure question." And she said, "Of course." And that was the whole of their conversation until they arrived. He handed her down with the flawless, practiced courtesy of a man who had been taught manners before he had been taught to walk, offered his arm for the length of the entrance hall, and was gone within 4 minutes of crossing the threshold, swallowed into a cluster of gentlemen, discussing corn prices and the war in the peninsula, his dark head visible above the crowd, like a mast above water, and just as far from shore. Charlotte found her customary place, near the long windows at the room's edge, which overlooked nothing more interesting than the Assembly Hall's kitchen garden, but which had the singular advantage of making a solitary woman look as though she were admiring a view, rather than standing entirely alone. She had grown skilled at this particular art of appearing occupied. She could stand for an hour with her chin at precisely the angle that suggested contentment, and no one she had tested this, quietly, over many such evenings no one thought to ask if she was quite well. Mrs. Fenwick, the wife of the local squire, a stout, cheerful woman of 50, who had appointed herself Charlotte's unofficial ally in a county, otherwise inclined to watch and whisper, drifted over with 2 glasses of ratafia and the particular gleam of a woman who has gossip and intends to share it. "He has been standing with the Luttrell men above 20 minutes, she said, without preamble, tipping her chin toward the far end of the room, where Sebastian's dark head rose above a cluster of gentlemen discussing, with evident passion, the merits of a new threshing method. I timed it. I confess I sometimes time it, my dear, purely out of scientific interest. You are a menace, Mrs. Fenwick. I am bored, which in a woman my age amounts to the same thing." She patted Charlotte's arm. "He is not a bad man, you understand. I have known him since he was breeched. He simply learned, very young and very thoroughly, that the way to survive his father's house was to feel nothing where anyone could see it. It does not mean there is nothing there. It only means someone will have to go looking for it, and I do not think anyone ever has." Charlotte turned this thought over for a moment, unwilling to let it warm her as much as it wanted to. "That is a great deal of generosity to extend to a man who forgot to introduce me to his own aunt at Christmas." "I did not say he was easy," Mrs. Fenwick said comfortably. "I said he was not bad. The two are not the same thing, whatever the poets tell you." And then, because she was a woman who did not believe in dwelling too long on melancholy truths, she nodded toward the door. "Now, who is that extremely well-made young man just arrived, and why does he have the look of someone about to make my evening considerably more entertaining?" Charlotte followed her gaze. Still not entirely well, whatever her carefully arranged face might have suggested to the room, still lonely in the specific, grinding way of a woman who has everything a woman of her station is meant to want, except the one thing no one thinks to mention is missing until it has been missing so long she has nearly forgotten its shape. "Forgive me," said a voice at her elbow, warm and entirely unembarrassed about the intrusion, "but I find I cannot stand across a room from the only interesting face in it for a second longer without introducing myself. Captain Frederick Carow, lately of His Majesty's 7th Foot, presently home from Spain, and thoroughly out of practice at English drawing-rooms." Charlotte turned. Captain Carow was perhaps 30, sun-browned, in a way that marked him instantly as a man who had spent recent years somewhere other than an English drawing room, with an open, unguarded face and the particular ease of someone who had faced worse things than a duchess's silence, and had come out the other side liking people rather better for it. He was looking directly at her, not past her toward the room, not through her toward some more useful conversation, but at her as though she were, at that moment, the single most worthwhile thing in the building. "Charlotte Hartley," she said, and could not resist adding, dryly, "and I ought to warn you, Captain, that I am almost certainly less interesting than I appear from across a room. I should like to form my own opinion on that, if you'll permit me." He smiled, not the polished smile of a man performing charm, but something crooked and genuine, the smile of a man who found the world entertaining, and was glad, specifically, that she was presently part of it. She realized, with a small, unwelcome jolt, that she had forgotten what it felt like to be looked at as though her presence were a pleasure rather than an obligation. He did not ask her to dance immediately. He simply began to talk about Spain, about the wretched roads and the worse food, about the particular quality of light in the mountains that he said he still dreamed of some nights, and then, because he was a man who listened as easily as he spoke, about her. Within 10 minutes, he had discovered, without her quite meaning to tell him, that she managed the greater part of the Wiltshire estate's daily business, kept its books, knew its tenants by name, and he said so plainly, without the careful, softening most Englishmen applied when a conversation strayed too near a woman's actual competence. "That is not a small thing you're describing," he said. "That is the running of an estate. It is only accounts and letters, Captain. It is only accounts and letters the way a ship's log is only ink," he said, "which is to say, not really when you look closely." Across the room, Sebastian Hartley finished his conversation about corn prices and turned, from long habit, to locate his wife the way a man checks that his watch is still in his pocket, not from any wish to look at the hour, but simply because it ought to be where it belongs. He found her by the windows, laughing a small sound. He was too far away to hear it, but he saw it happen in the whole change of her face, the lift of it, the light in it at something a sun-browned stranger in a red coat had said to her. He did not move toward them. He told himself, with the flat certainty he applied to most things, that he was not a jealous man, that he had never had cause to be, that his wife was faithful past any reasonable doubt. But something in his chest had gone very still and very attentive, the way a man goes still when he hears, from a great distance, a sound he cannot yet identify, but suspects he ought to be able to. It was 2 mornings later, in the breakfast room, with the early light still pale gold across the white cloth, that Sebastian Hartley said 4 words that would occupy rather more of Charlotte's thoughts than she wished to admit. She had risen early, as she always did, and taken her customary seat across the impossible length of the breakfast table from her husband, who was, as always, occupied with his correspondence. She had poured his chocolate out of habit, though he had not asked her to, and rarely touched it before it went cold, and she had been on the point of rising to see about the tenant cottages at Marsh End, when he set down his letter, cleared his throat once, and said, without quite looking at her, "You looked well on Thursday, in the Ivory." Then he rose, walked to the door, and was gone before she had fully understood what had happened. Charlotte sat very still with her hand flat on the cool linen of the tablecloth. 11 months. 11 months and 6 days. and those 5 words offered unprompted, in a low voice, by a man who had never once told her she looked like anything at all, were the nearest he had come, in the whole of their marriage, to seeing her. She did not cry. She pressed her palm harder against the table and breathed and thought, "Something has changed. I do not know what. I do not know whether it matters. But something has changed." And she thought, with the same breath, of Captain Caro's genuinely delighted eyes, and her own unexpected laugh, and the strange, guilty warmth of having been, for 1/2 hour, entirely seen by someone. She thought of these 2 things side by side and felt the shape of a question she was not yet ready to ask herself. What am I still willing to give to a marriage that gives nothing back? She rose, found her cold chocolate not worth finishing, and went to find Mr. Prescott and the household accounts, because the estate did not run itself, and because Charlotte Fairfax, whatever name she now carried, had never in her life been a woman who waited for things to come to her when she might instead walk toward them. What Charlotte did not know could not know, because he had built his entire marriage upon the careful architecture of her. Not knowing was that Sebastian Hartley had not offered for her out of duty alone, and that the debts he had settled for Sir Henry Fairfax had not been the whole of the story. 18 months before their marriage, Sebastian had attended a country assembly in Hampshire, at the invitation of a college friend, a gathering of no particular importance to a man of his rank, and had watched, from across a crowded room, a young woman in a gown, 3 seasons out of fashion, kneel without the slightest self-consciousness in the mud of a garden path to bandage the cut paw of a stray dog that had wandered in from the lane, speaking to the frightened animal in a low, steady voice, while the assembly's other guests looked on with polite disgust. He had not been introduced to her that evening. He had, in fact, left without learning her name, and had spent 1.5 years telling himself that the memory of her steady hands, low voice, entirely unbothered by ruined gloves, was a foolish thing to carry. He had learned her name only when his solicitor, Mr. Lawrence Kensington, a careful, grey-eyed man of business who had served the Wiltshire family for 2 decades, brought him the particulars of Sir Henry Fairfax's debts. Debts which, Kensington had discovered with some alarm, were not owed in the ordinary way to ordinary creditors, but had been quietly and systematically bought up by an agent, acting on behalf of the Earl of Pemberton, Lady Cecilia's father, with the express purpose of forcing Sir Henry into bankruptcy, and his daughter into a marriage with Cecilia's disreputable younger brother, a match that would have ruined the girl in every sense that mattered. Sebastian had recognized the name Fairfax within the hour. He had bought every note himself before the week was out, quietly, through 3 separate agents, so that no one, least of all the Fairfax family, would ever know the debts had changed hands at all, and had then done the one thing that would settle the matter beyond any scheme's reach. He had married her. He had told himself it was practical. He had told himself, in the cold private hours, when a man is honest only with the ceiling above his bed, that it was also the one piece of luck he had ever permitted himself to reach for. And then, because his mother's contempt for the match was instant and total, and because he had understood correctly, as it happened that Cecilia Pemberton did not forgive being outmaneuvered, and would look for any weakness in Charlotte to exploit, he had done what he believed, in his own grim and mistaken way, was the safest thing he could do for her. He had said nothing, he had shown nothing. He had reasoned that a wife who was plainly, visibly, unloved could not be used as a weapon against her, and he had built, brick by silent brick, exactly the prison he was trying to protect her from. It was, he would come to understand far too slowly, the single greatest miscalculation of his life. Autumn deepened into the particular grey business of an English November, and the small unspoken war at Amberley Hall proceeded on two fronts. Charlotte did not fully understand until later. On the first front, she found herself treated, with increasing and deliberate frequency, less like the mistress of the house, and more like an upper servant within it. The Dowager Duchess had a genius for small humiliations, delivered with perfect civility, instructing Charlotte to review the linen inventory herself, rather than trust it to the housekeeper. "Since you have such a talent for figures, my dear," or seating her, at a dinner for neighboring families, several places below where a duchess ought properly to sit, with an apology so smooth it could not be challenged without appearing petty. Susan, her maid, grew subtly careless. A gown left improperly pressed, a message forgotten. Small enough failures that no single one seemed worth remarking on, all of them together forming a slow erosion Charlotte felt but could not name. On the second front, quieter and stranger, were the moments that did not fit the pattern at all. There was the afternoon in late November when Charlotte, riding out alone along the river path against her mother-in-law's expressed wishes, was thrown from her mare when a hare startled it on the frost-hard ground, and returned to Amberley with a wrenched wrist swelling badly beneath her glove. Sebastian had been in the stable-yard when she rode in, and had crossed the distance to her horse before the groom could reach it, lifting her down himself his hands. She would remember afterward with an embarrassing clarity, careful and sure and entirely gentle around her waist, and had carried her wrist to the light of the stable lantern with a focus she had never once seen him direct at anything of hers before. "It is not broken," he said, low, his thumb moving with surprising care along the bone, "but it wants binding and cold water, and you will not ride out alone again without telling someone where you mean to go." His voice had none of its usual flatness. It had, if she was not imagining it, something close to fear in it. "I did not think you would notice if I did not return," she said, before she could stop herself. He looked at her then, really looked, the grey of his eyes, gone dark and unguarded for the length of perhaps 3 heartbeats, and said nothing at all, but did not let go of her wrist a moment before he strictly needed to. There was the evening, some weeks later, when a sudden December storm caught them both, crossing the lower garden on the way back from the home farm, and they had taken shelter under the stone arch of the old dovecote, rain hammering the slate above them, close enough in the narrow space that she could feel the warmth coming off him through her cloak, and he had, without any apparent decision to do so, reached up and brushed a strand of wet hair from her cheek with 2 fingers, an act so small and so entirely unlike him that neither of them mentioned it again, though Charlotte thought of it, unbidden, for days. Neither of them spoke of what these moments meant. Neither of them, in truth, quite dared to. But something had begun, quietly, beneath the frost of their marriage, not yet trust, not yet anything so bold as hope, but the first faint thaw of it, and Charlotte, lying awake in her own chamber some nights, found she was no longer entirely certain which man she was angry at. The husband who ignored her in every drawing-room in the county, or the one who had held her wrist as though it were made of glass. There was, too, the night in early December, when sleeplessness drove her down to the library. At an hour, no respectable duchess ought to be wandering the house alone, and she found Sebastian already there before her, in shirt-sleeves and without his cravat, an unfamiliar and faintly startling state of undress for a man she had never once seen less than fully buttoned. A glass of brandy untouched at his elbow, and a book open on his knee that he did not appear to be reading. "I did not think to find company," she said, already retreating toward the door. "Stay," he said, and it came out rougher than he seemed to intend, so that he cleared his throat and tried again, more evenly. "Please, I would rather not be alone with my thoughts tonight, if you are willing to be alone with yours somewhere in the same room." She stayed. She took the chair opposite, and for a long while neither of them spoke at all, the fire cracking low in the grate, and the house entirely silent around them. And there was something in the shared quiet that felt entirely unlike the silences she had grown used to, not an absence, but a companionship. The particular comfort of two people who did not need to fill every space between them with words to know the other was there. "What are you reading?" she asked eventually, nodding at the book he had still not turned a page of. "Nothing," he admitted. "I have read the same paragraph 11 times. I find I cannot fix my attention on it tonight." He looked at her then, properly, the firelight doing something warm and unguarded to the gray of his eyes. "You have a way of arriving in a room and taking up all the available attention in it, Duchess. I do not know when that began. I only know I have stopped being able to read a book in the same house as you without being aware the entire time of exactly where you are." She did not know what to say to that. She sat very still, her heart doing something entirely undignified in her chest, and said only, "I did not know you were aware of where I was at all." "I am aware," he said quietly, "of everything to do with you. I have simply been very poor at showing it." And then, because he seemed to hear how much that had cost him to say, he looked away into the fire and did not speak again, and she let the silence hold them both a while longer before she said good night. And neither of them mentioned the conversation again, though Charlotte lay awake a long time afterward, turning the words over like a coin she was not yet ready to spend. Captain Carrow, meanwhile, had not gone away. He called at Amberley with a regularity that was, strictly, within the bounds of propriety. He was, after all, connected to the neighborhood through his cousin, and the dowager, who despised Charlotte, was perfectly content to see a personable young officer pay court to her, on the theory, never spoken aloud but plainly understood, that a scandal involving the Duchess would trouble no one so much as the Duke himself. Charlotte, for her part, welcomed Carrow's visits with a warmth that surprised her, not because she loved him. She understood this clearly, and never once deceived herself about it, but because he made her laugh, unguardedly, in a house where laughter had become a rare and slightly suspicious commodity, and because being with him reminded her, gently and without cruelty, that she was still a woman capable of being delighted. The Wiltshire Winter Ball, held each December in the great hall at Amberley, was by long custom the grandest evening of the county's calendar. And that year, Charlotte had thrown herself into its planning with the same ferocious competence she applied to everything else that was hers to manage ordering hothouse flowers from Bath. Despite the dowager's pointed remarks about expense, rearranging the seating 3 times until it satisfied her, and standing over the kitchens for the better part of a week, to ensure the supper would want for nothing. She wore deep blue that night, a color she had chosen deliberately after a whole autumn of pale, unremarkable creams, and Mrs. Prescott, pinning the last curl into place, told her frankly that she looked like a woman who intended to be noticed, and Charlotte had laughed and said that was, in fact, rather the general idea. The evening began, as these evenings always did in that household, in a small comedy of near disaster. The youngest Luttrell boy, overexcited and undersupervised, upended an entire tray of lobster patties directly into Lord Rutherford's lap not 10 minutes after the receiving line concluded, an event that sent 2 footmen scrambling and reduced half the assembled dowagers to a fit of poorly disguised laughter, and which Sebastian, arriving at Charlotte's side rather sooner in the evening than his custom, observed with a dryness that startled a genuine laugh out of her. "I begin to suspect," he murmured, "that no gathering at Amberley is complete without some manner of catastrophe involving seafood. I recall a similar incident at my own christening, or so my mother claims, though I have always suspected she embellishes it for effect. You are in an unusually good humor tonight, Your Grace." "I find," he said, and there was something almost boyish in the admission, entirely unlike him, "that I have been practicing it. Humor, that is. I am told it improves with use, rather like a rusted hinge. And who has been giving you these lessons?" "My own conscience, mostly, and a certain persistent housekeeper who has taken to leaving improving pamphlets on my desk with titles like On the Cultivation of Domestic Warmth." He glanced sideways at her, and there was real warmth in it now, unguarded and entirely without his customary caution. "I find I am a slow student, but not, I hope, an unwilling one." Charlotte was still turning over what to make of that unexpected softness when the musicians struck up the evening's opening set, and Captain Carrow arrived at her elbow with his usual easy grin to claim her hand for it, and the small, strange warmth of the moment with her husband was carried off, for a time, into the general bright noise of the ball, though Charlotte found, dancing the opening set with Carrow's cheerful chatter-washing pleasantly over her, that some part of her attention had stayed behind near the doorway, watching to see whether Sebastian would come to find her again before the evening ended. It was Carrow's frank, teasing company, and nothing more, that Charlotte accepted a second time at the Wiltshire winter ball in December, when he claimed her hand for the opening set, and then, an hour later, for a second, and then, to the visible, delighted scandal of half the room, for a third, an audacity that no unmarried man would have dared, and that even a married woman's admirer rarely attempted, 3 dances being, by every rule of the ballroom, a declaration far louder than words. Sebastian Hartley watched his wife dance a third time with Captain Frederick Carrow from across his own ballroom, and felt something in his chest that he did not, at first, recognize, because he had spent so many years being taught not to feel it that he had genuinely forgotten its name. It arrived when it arrived fully, with the force of a blow. Not merely jealousy, though there was plenty of that, hot and unfamiliar and entirely unwelcome, but grief the sudden, complete understanding that he had built, with his own silence, exactly the conditions in which another man's warmth would look, to any reasonable woman, like water offered to someone dying of thirst. He crossed the floor before he had fully decided to. He did not make a scene. He was not a man built for scenes, but he reached the edge of the dance floor as the set ended, and said, with a quiet that carried none the less, "I believe the next dance is promised to me, Duchess," in a tone that allowed no argument, and, more strangely, no retreat. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. You have never asked me to dance before, Your Grace. Not in all the time we have been married. I am asking now. Why? He did not answer immediately, and in the silence, with 200 pairs of eyes politely pretending not to watch, she saw something move behind the gray of his eyes that she had never once seen there before, something that looked, astonishingly, like fear. "Because I have been a fool," he said, low enough that only she could hear it. "And I am beginning, very late, to understand exactly how great a fool, and I would rather dance badly with my own wife in front of the whole county than watch her dance well with anyone else for one more evening." She gave him her hand. It was not, she would think later, forgiveness not yet, not nearly. But it was a beginning, and after so long a silence, a beginning was very nearly everything. The scandal, when it came from precisely the direction Charlotte least expected, and struck with a speed that left her no time to defend herself, before half the county had already formed its opinion. It was Susan who arranged it, Susan, whom Charlotte had trusted with her hair and her small confidences, and never once suspected of anything worse than carelessness. Lady Cecilia Pemberton, furious past all reason at the sight of the Duke, dancing 3 times in an evening with the wife she had spent a year despising, had paid Susan handsomely to arrange what followed. A note, forged in a passable imitation of Charlotte's hand, inviting Captain Carow to the Wiltshire library at an hour when the household was known to be occupied elsewhere, and a second note to the Dowager Duchess suggesting, with poisonous delicacy, that she might wish to look in on her daughter-in-law that same evening. Charlotte, who had received no such invitation and had gone to the library only to fetch a book she had left there, found herself, at 10:30, standing 3 feet from a bewildered Captain Carow, who had received the forged note and arrived in perfectly innocent confusion at precisely the moment the library door opened to admit the Dowager Duchess. Lady Cecilia Pemberton on her arm, wearing an expression of manufactured, delighted horror, and a small cluster of guests drawn along, ostensibly, by the noise of raised voices that Cecilia herself had arranged to be overheard. "Well," said the Dowager, into a silence that had gone entirely, dangerously still. "Well, I confess I hardly know what to say." "There is nothing to say," Charlotte said, and heard the thinness in her own voice and hated it. "Because there is nothing here to be said about. Captain Carow received a note. I did not send it." "How very convenient," said Cecilia, "that you should have an explanation prepared so quickly." It was Sebastian's voice, arriving from the doorway behind them with a coldness that made even his mother go still. That ended the moment before it could grow any worse. "Convenient," he said. "Is the note itself, Lady Cecilia, written, I think, in a hand that will not survive close comparison with my wife's actual correspondence, of which I possess a great deal, and which I intend to have examined before this house sees another hour pass?" The room, which had been holding its breath in the particular delighted way-rooms, when scandal seems imminent, went very still. Cecilia's composure did not crack. She was too well schooled for that, but something behind her eyes moved, quick and calculating. The look of a woman recounting her own arithmetic and not liking the sum. "You would take a servant's forgery over your own mother's eyes, Sebastian," the Dowager said, though her voice, for the first time in Charlotte's hearing, had lost some of its habitual certainty. "I would take the truth over whatever is most convenient for the people who benefit from my wife's ruin, mother. Yes." He crossed the room and stood deliberately. Between Charlotte and the small gathered crowd, a wall of a man placing himself where a wall was needed. "Captain Carow, you received a note this evening, in what you believed to be my wife's hand." Carow, to his credit, had gone very white, but did not flinch. "I did, Your Grace. I have it in my coat this moment, and I will place it in your hands, or a magistrate's, with considerable relief, because I have been standing here for the better part of 10 minutes, wondering how in God's name I came to be cast as the villain of a play I did not know I was performing in." "Then let us compare it," Sebastian said, "to a letter my wife wrote me not 4 days past, which I have upstairs, and which I suspect any honest eye in this room will find does not match at all." He looked, finally, directly at Cecilia. "I find I am curious, Lady Cecilia, how you came to arrive at my library at precisely the hour a scandal was arranged to occur in it. That strikes me as rather more than coincidence." "I was invited," Cecilia said too quickly, and heard the mistake the instant it left her mouth. "By whom?" Sebastian said, very quietly. "Since my wife tells me she sent no invitations at all this evening." Cecilia said nothing. It was, Charlotte would think later, the most satisfying silence she had ever witnessed in her life. What followed, over the 3 days that came after, was not the quiet, gradual thing Sebastian had always imagined the truth would be when it finally surfaced. It arrived instead all at once, in the manner of a dam giving way. Mr. Kensington, summoned at first light, confirmed within an afternoon that the hand on the forged note was not Charlotte's, and pressed further, and not gently, that a payment of £40 had passed from Lady Cecilia Pemberton's own account to one Susan Mears within the fortnight prior. Susan, faced with the accounts and the prospect of prosecution for fraud, wept and confessed everything inside an hour. The letters carried to Cecilia across the better part of a year, the forged note, the whole shabby architecture of the scheme. Charlotte asked to see her alone before any decision was made about what became of her, and Mrs. Prescott, disapproving but obedient, brought Susan to the small sitting room where Charlotte sat with her hands folded in her lap, considerably less composed than she hoped she looked. "Why?" Charlotte asked simply when the door had closed. "I trusted you with a great deal, Susan, more than I trusted anyone in this house for a long while." Susan would not meet her eyes at first. "My mother is ill, Your Grace. The physician wants money I have not got, and £40 is more than I earn in 3 years in this house." And Lady Cecilia made it sound. She made it sound as though it would only be a small unhappiness, a note, nothing that would truly harm anyone. And by the time I understood what she truly meant to do with it, I had already taken the money and did not know how to give it back without losing my place, and my mother losing her physician along with it. She looked up then, eyes red-rimmed and entirely without excuse in them. "It is no defense. I know it is no defense. I would take it back if I could, every part of it." Charlotte studied her for a long moment, weighing, in the particular careful way her mother had taught her, mercy against consequence. "You will not stay in this house," she said finally. "I cannot trust you with my hairbrush, let alone my confidences, ever again, and you know that as well as I do. But I will not see your mother go without a physician for my sake, whatever else you have done." She rose and went to her writing desk and wrote out a note, and pressed it into Susan's startled hands. "This is a reference to my old housekeeper at Fairleigh, who wants a girl for plain sewing and asked me only last month if I knew of anyone honest. You are not, at present, entirely honest. I am gambling that you might become so, given a second chance and rather less temptation than this house apparently offered you. Do not make me regret it. Susan left Amberley within the week, weeping again, though for entirely different reasons, and Charlotte never saw her again, though a letter reached her the following spring, unsigned but unmistakable in its hand, thanking her for a kindness the writer said she had done nothing whatsoever to deserve. And it was in that same investigation, conducted a year before in the quiet weeks after he had settled Sir Henry's debts, that Kensington had turned up a second truth one that had nothing to do with Cecilia's malice, and everything to do with the very foundation of the dowager's contempt, and which Sebastian had kept locked away with all his other unspoken things, because he had never found a way to hand it to Charlotte without confessing how thoroughly he had gone looking into her family before he had ever properly courted her. Charlotte's grandmother, Kensington had discovered from a packet of letters yellowed with age, had been born Lady Rosalind Devereux, the eldest daughter of the Earl of Northumberland, disinherited and struck from the family entirely for eloping at 19 with a penniless country clergyman, Charlotte's own grandfather, against her father's express wishes. The old Earl had died without ever forgiving her. His current heir, a distant cousin who had held the title only 6 years, had no notion any such kinswoman existed. Charlotte Fairfax Hartley, whom the Dowager Duchess had dismissed for the better part of a year as beneath the notice of good breeding, was the granddaughter of an earl on her mother's side better born, in the strict arithmetic of English rank that the Dowager herself worshipped, than Cecilia Pemberton had ever been. Mr. Kensington brought the letters to Amberley himself, 3 days before Twelfth Night, at the Duke's own request, and laid them out on the library table with the careful reverence of a man, handling something he had been asked to keep sealed away for a year, and was plainly relieved to finally set down in the light. Charlotte read them standing, because she found she could not trust herself to sit, tracing her grandmother's maiden hand, a hand she had never seen, and yet found, disorientingly, familiar in its slant and its impatience, across page after page of a young woman's fierce, unrepentant love letters, written from a country parsonage to a father who had never answered a single one. "I do not ask your forgiveness, Papa," one read, dated some 50 years before, "for I have done nothing that wants forgiving. I have married a good man for love, which you have never once told me was a foolish thing to want, only an unsuitable one. I hope, when your anger has cooled, that you will find it in yourself to distinguish between the two." "He never did answer," Kensington said quietly, watching Charlotte's face. "There is no record he ever softened. Your grandmother died believing herself entirely forgotten by her family, Your Grace. I am sorry to be the one to tell you so." "Do not be sorry," Charlotte said, and found her voice was not quite steady. She was not forgotten. She simply had to wait 50 years for someone to go looking for her. She looked up at Sebastian, who had come to stand at her shoulder, without her quite noticing, reading over her arm with an expression she had never once seen on him before, something unguarded and fierce and entirely without armor. "You did this," she said. "You had Kensington search." "I had Kensington search your family's papers the week I settled your father's debts," Sebastian said, "because I wanted to know everything about the woman I was about to marry. And I found, instead, a story I did not know how to give back to you without explaining why I had gone looking for it in the first place. I have been carrying it for a year, Charlotte, along with a great many other things I did not know how to say." She did not answer him then. She only reached out and took his hand across the table over the 50-year-old letters of a grandmother neither of them had ever met, and held it, and that was answer enough for both of them. Sebastian sought out Captain Caro the following morning, finding him taking a grim, solitary breakfast at the village inn, plainly expecting to be called out before noon. "I have come," Sebastian said, seating himself uninvited across the small table, "to apologize, and I find I am somewhat out of practice, so I beg your patience while I locate the words." Caro set down his fork with visible caution. "I confess, Your Grace, I had rather expected pistols to this meeting, not conversation." "I considered it," Sebastian admitted, "for approximately the length of time it took me to remember that you behaved, throughout the entire wretched business, with considerably more honor than I did across the better part of a year. You danced with my wife because she was lonely, and you were kind enough to notice it, which is more than I managed to do myself in all the months I have spent living in the same house as her. I do not think that merits pistols. I think it merits my gratitude, however badly I am expressing it." Caro studied him for a long moment, and then, slowly, something like a smile crept back onto his face. "Well, that is not at all the conversation I prepared for. I had a very good speech ready about honor and intentions that I am now rather sorry to waste. You may deliver it another time. I find I owe you a debt regardless, and I am told on good authority," the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but its nearest relation, "that I am tolerably good at settling those." "I have heard that about you," Caro said, and laughed, and held out his hand, and Sebastian, who had spent 28 years believing that dignity and warmth were incompatible qualities in a man, discovered he could, in fact, manage both at once, and found the discovery came as something of a relief. The 12th night gathering that closed the Wiltshire season that year was, by long tradition, the grandest event on the county calendar, and it was there, before the assembled cream of 3 counties, that Sebastian Hartley chose to say, publicly and without any of his usual armor, everything he had spent the whole of their marriage failing to say in private. He did not wait for a quiet corner. He crossed the ballroom floor in full view of everyone who had ever watched him ignore his wife at every gathering of the season, and he went down on one knee before her a duke, on his own ballroom floor, in front of 200 witnesses, in a gesture so entirely unlike him that the music actually faltered before the leader recovered himself. "I married you," he said, loudly enough to carry, "to save you from a scheme I did not think you should ever have to know existed. And then I was coward enough to hide behind silence rather than tell you the truth, because I feared that if the world saw how much I cared for you, the world would find a way to use it against you. I was wrong. I have been wrong since the very first morning of our marriage, in front of all of you, and I will not spend one more evening pretending otherwise. Charlotte Fairfax Hartley, Duchess of Wiltshire. Granddaughter of an earl and mistress of an estate, she has run better than I have run my own life. I love you. I have loved you, I think, since I watched you kneel in the mud of a Hampshire garden to bandage a dog no one else would touch, and I am asking you, in front of everyone who has ever doubted you, whether you will let me spend the rest of my life earning what I have so badly failed to earn so far." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Charlotte looked down at her husband, this cold, contained, silent man on his knee in front of the whole county, his gray eyes for once entirely undefended, and found that her mother's old counsel, the one about never disappearing, about never making oneself so small the world forgot to look, had finally, at long last, nowhere left to hide. "Get up, Sebastian," she said, and her voice, to her own faint surprise, was not unkind. "You will ruin your good trousers, and I have only just decided to let you keep them." The room, uncertain until that moment which way the evening would break, dissolved into startled, delighted laughter, and beneath the cover of it, Sebastian rose and took his wife's face in both his hands and kissed her in front of his mother, in front of Lady Cecilia Pemberton, who stood white and cornered near the door. Her scheme laid bare that same evening before the county's assembled witnesses, her families standing about to suffer a blow from which it would take a decade to recover, and in front of every soul who had ever watched Charlotte stand alone by a window and assumed she did not mind it. The Dowager Duchess, to her credit, said nothing at all for a long moment, and then crossed the floor herself, and took Charlotte's hand, the one not still caught in her son's, in both of her own, and said, with something that might, in a woman less proud, have been called an apology, "I did not know about your grandmother, child. I ought to have troubled myself to know a great many things about you rather sooner than I did. It was left to old Lord Rutherford, master of ceremonies for the evening, and a man with a lifelong appetite for drama that his mild manner disguised beautifully, to deliver the final blow, and he did it with the particular relish of a man who had never much cared for the Pemberton family's heirs. He crossed to where Cecilia stood, still white, still cornered, and bowed with exaggerated courtesy. "Lady Cecilia," he said, pitch to Carrie, "I understand from the Duke's solicitor that a most interesting matter of forgery and bribery wants investigating, and that your name features rather prominently in the particulars. I feel I ought to mention it now, while the whole county happens to be conveniently assembled in one room, so that no one need trouble themselves to spread the news separately tomorrow. So much more efficient this way, don't you find?" The laughter that followed was not unkind exactly, but it was not kind either, and it was the sound, more than anything the Duke had said, that broke Cecilia Pemberton's composure at last. She left the ballroom with her chin still lifted, out of long habit if nothing else, but she left it alone, and word travelled through 3 counties. Before the week was out that the Earl of Pemberton had removed his daughter to relations in the north with no fixed date of return, and that the fine dinner invitations that had once flowed so freely to the Pemberton family had, rather suddenly, dried up entirely. Lady Cecilia Pemberton left Wiltshire before dawn, and did not return to that county again. Charlotte would confess, some years later, to a very small and entirely unsanctified satisfaction at the sight of it, a satisfaction her mother would certainly have told her was beneath a truly gracious woman, and which Charlotte decided, on the whole, she did not much mind possessing anyway. It was a fine, sharp morning, some weeks later, the kind of pale winter sunlight that makes every frosted branch at Amberley look silvered when Sebastian found his wife in the walled garden, kneeling exactly as she had knelt in that Hampshire garden 1.5 years before he had ever properly met her, bandaging the paw of a half-grown collie pup that had wandered in from the home farm with a thorn caught deep in its foot, speaking to it in the same low, steady voice he had never forgotten. "You are going to keep that animal," he said, coming to crouch beside her, entirely unconcerned, for the first time in his adult life, about the state of his own knees in the frost. "I am," she agreed. "He has excellent manners for a stray, better than some dukes I could name." "I am told," Sebastian said gravely, "that dukes are notoriously slow learners. You are not wrong." She glanced sideways at him, and there was nothing guarded left in the look at all. "But I have found, on the whole, that the slow ones are worth the waiting, once they finally arrive." He took her bandaged hand, not the dog's paw, her own hand, ungloved, cold with morning air, and pressed it, briefly and entirely without an audience to witness it, to his lips. "And Charlotte Hartley, Duchess of Wiltshire, granddaughter of an earl, mistress of a house that had very nearly swallowed her whole, understood at last that she had never once disappeared. If Charlotte and Sebastian's story stayed with you, tell us in the comments which moment hit you the hardest, the silence, the 3 dances, or the words he finally found the courage to say. If you'd like more stories like this one, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next. And thank you, truly, for staying with us until the end.